Okay, folks, here we are. Finally, we have reached Buddhism. And there's a lot to say here. Buddhism typically starts with, and I think it should start with, the story of the Buddha's life. He was a real person, a prince named Siddartha Gautama. For those of you who've read will know. And it starts with his life because his life is such a deep part of the philosophy that would eventually develop. A lot of the things he notices, for instance, this sense of unease or uncertainty or what he would later call a lack of permanence, and he would later label dukkha within us, that is sometimes translated as suffering, but is not at all the right translation for what he was really talking about. But anyways, the life of the Buddha, as we'll see, and I'll go over it briefly in this video, the life of the Buddha gives rise to so many of the concepts that would become the foundation of the religion or belief system, however you want to categorize it, that it's just indispensable. Leading up until his enlightenment, usually said to be around age 36. So just a few things to start with. Buddha wasn't his real name. I just mentioned his name was Siddartha Gautama. Buddha means the enlightened one, or the awakened one, to be awake. And there had been other Buddhas before him. Some of them were supernatural. Some of them were said to be, avatars of some kind of deities. And so to distinguish him, he's often called Shakyamuni Buddha. And Muni just means monk, and Shakya, he was part of a clan. He was part of the Shakya clan, which was remember we talked about the caste system. It was actually part of the upper caste. So he was part of the Kshatriya class, which, if you remember from the earlier chapters in Hinduism, this was the warrior class. So he's one of the top level of the caste system. And as we'll see, this is going to play a role in his entire enlightenment process, because ultimately he has everything he wants, from social status to being a strong, good-looking guy, to having friends and loved ones and having an entire kingdom he's going to inherit. And none of that is really enough to find the true deep meaning of life. It's also important to talk about the historical context that the Buddha was coming into. And many comparisons here are made to Jesus, and I think I may have made them before in previous videos, so let me sharpen that up a little bit. Jesus comes into the tradition of Judaism that had existed for almost 1,000 years. And at that part in the Middle East, at that location in the Middle East, that was the dominant religion. And so he comes in to this religion, and Jesus, although he is continuing that tradition and carries on some of their beliefs, he's also clashing with some of the people of the old Jewish tradition, with the Pharisees and so forth, who were more strict in terms of how ceremonies were conducted and kind of wanted to stick with the old ways. So Jesus charts this new path that develops an entirely new religion, but built upon the old religion. That's why the Old Testament, sometimes called the Torah, was essentially the Jewish holy book. And the Bible together includes that, which we now call the Old Testament, and the New Testament, which is the Gospels and the rest of it, that documents the life of Jesus and more. So in the same way, not in exactly the same way, I'll talk about some differences with Jesus in a bit, but in a similar way, Buddha comes into the Hindu tradition that we just talked about. For thousands of years, even longer than there had been Judaism when Jesus came into things, for thousands of years there had been the Hindu tradition. The idea of Brahmanatman was strong and deep within the culture. If you wanted to be enlightened or awakened or come to some higher spiritual truth, you were generally told, well, you need to find the Atman within you, and you need to follow the path of yoga. Right? That was generally the idea. And people were actually accorded great respect who went off and decided, I'm going to give away all my stuff and focus in on finding the Atman within me and living a spiritual life. Even back then, it wasn't a common path. Many people didn't do it, but it was nevertheless respected. So the Buddha, Siddhartha, comes into that tradition, and he ultimately charts a new path. And fundamentally, his core belief that would become the foundation leading to enlightenment is this belief that's often translated as an-atman, right? An meaning not, or negation of. Atman is the idea that there's a soul within us that is truly a universal soul, right? Atman Brahm, Brahman Atman, as we've talked about. On Atman, Buddha was denying that, right? So the Buddha, Siddhartha, after his enlightenment experience, he denies that there's the Atman. And his entire core is the Anatman is that actually there's nothing. And true enlightenment, true awakening comes when you realize that there's no center to who you are. You are actually merely just a pattern, like a hurricane or a whirlpool that we call a name and that has certain evolutionary tendencies, we call them today. But really you're just a pattern. There's no core, not even a spiritual core of Atman. Right? So that would have been a tremendous affront to the spiritual tradition of the time. And so again, Jesus was revolutionary in the Western world, and Buddha was revolutionary in the Eastern world for these reasons. But before we get there, and before I talk about how he was led to that enlightenment experience, and I'll talk about enlightenment probably in one of the next videos, let's talk a bit about his life. Okay, so he was born as a prince in up in northern India, where we would now we do now. It's now a country called Nepal, in between China and India. You can see on a map. And Buddha is born into a kingdom there of the, like I said, of the Shakya clan. And his life, which as you'll see in the book, is essentially retold in the Pali Canon. Just in the same case with Jesus, most of what's written about him is written by disciples or by people who followed him. So a lot of it is fantastical. It's not like today where you have multiple historians and you can kind of triangulate what happened. So a lot of the story of the Buddha, we know he was a real person historically, but a lot of the story I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of supernatural elements that are part of the story. So there's stories that he chose his own mother before birth, who would end up actually dying in birth, and then in giving birth to him. And then there was a sage who predicted and said, once he was born, said, this is a special boy. And he predicted, he said, either he's going to be a serious spiritual teacher, so he's already predicted to be a spiritual teacher, or he's going to be a great king. And from the beginning, his father, of course, wanting his lineage to go on and wanting to continue the kingdom, his father says, I want him to be a great king. And so he grooms him to be a great king, secretly not really wanting him to be a spiritual teacher. So it's not that his father wanted him to be, a hedonist. I don't know if any of you've heard that word, just kind of following, just, eating and indulging in things. But he wanted him to be a finely, cultured person, a connoisseur, somebody who we would say today enjoys fine wines and, cigars and things like that and goes to nice restaurants. He wanted him to be part of the upper crust. Right, they're already part of this higher level clan in a higher level caste, and he wants the Buddha, who would become the Buddha at the time was Siddartha, he wants his son to be like that. And so there's all sorts of stories that he, in order to prevent his son Siddartha from seeing the true state of the world, he shielded him from seeing any kinds of suffering. To the point where some stories say that he had his men and servants and stuff remove even dead leaves from the castle garden, right, from the palace garden. He didn't even want the Buddha to be reminded at all of the negative parts of life, of the death and the disease that can afflict people. And least of which he wanted the Buddha to see, Siddhartha to see the outside of the palace, where there was much more death and destruction and despair than there would be inside the palace, especially in other lower castes and so forth. So at first, as a young man, and into his 20s, Siddartha lives the full life of what his father wants. He does become a connoisseur of culture. He's good at everything. It's not one of those things where everyone resents the boss's son, like at a company where they're not really worthy, but he gets special treatment just because he's the boss's son. No, he really was good. And Siddartha really was a great archer. He really was a great at everything he did. He was refined. He was, well spoken. He was handsome. He had confidence. He carried himself well, and so forth. So all of these things were going for him. And eventually, he gets the most beautiful woman in the kingdom. And there's, just to kind of add to the legend, there's a story that he was competing. One of the ways that men would compete for women back then was they'd shoot archery, and whoever got closest to the bullseye, would have a chance with the woman. And supposedly, another great archer hits the bullseye, and is going to get what became Siddhartha's wife. And Siddhartha shoots, and he shoots so well it splits the other guy's arrow in half and puts it off the bullseye. And Siddhartha's arrow goes right in between in the bullseye, and he gets the girl. Right. So all of this is clearly fantastical, just to kind of bump up the story. And as we'll see, it's important in this story that it's bumped up this way. It's important that it's exaggerated, because that's going to play a role in what happens in the Buddha's when he becomes the Buddha in Siddhartha's enlightenment. And so he gets the girl, has a beautiful wife, has a son, and everything seems to be going well. But then something interesting starts to happen to him. He starts to kind of wonder, because he has everything he could ever want. He starts to, materially speaking, he starts to kind of notice that he's not fully truly happy, and happy isn't even the right word. But there's kind of an absence within him, a lack of something, and he wonders, is this really all life is? Just material things? Like, is that it? Am I going to live the rest of my long life? And he's in his 20s at this time. Am I going to live the rest of my entire life just pursuing beautiful things and being a connoisseur of nice wines and so forth? And he finds something lacking. There's something missing within him. And this later he would identify as the term dukkha, which would become the first noble truth we'll talk about later. That within us, until we truly realize our true nature, the true nature of reality, and again, I'll talk about that later, until we realize that no matter how many good things we have, material possessions, the partner we want, whatever, no matter how much we have, there will always be this underlying kind of subtle sense of dissatisfaction. And sometimes that word dukkha is indeed translated as lack of satisfaction, right? It's translated wrongly as suffering, because it's not suffering per se. It's that even when you're apparently not suffering, you're still suffering, right? I'm using that term just to make the point. Again, lack of satisfaction is a better way to say it. But anyways, the point is he notices that, and he eventually decides, I got to get the hell out of this palace. I've lived here my whole life. I want to see what else is out there. I've heard stories, and I know my parents have been sheltering me, but I've got to know for myself what's out there. Now, his parents aren't going to stop him from doing anything, but they will try to persuade him against it. And his dad, his father. And his father ultimately does not want him to leave the palace, but Siddhartha finally decides, I'm going to leave, and tells his father anyway. And as he's about to leave and go off with his driver, and this is kind of another, in my opinion, kind of funny part of the story, but fantastical as well, his father, the king, says, well, he tells his men to go out there and to just on the Buddha's way into town, outside of the palace, he basically says, try to make things look nicer, which presumably is blocking off, the view of poverty, stricken places, covering up the view of a house that's maybe dilapidated and old, and stuff like that, so that the Buddha doesn't end up seeing the reality beyond the palace, right? In other words, to use the term of today's world, nerfing his entire trip into the outside of the palace. But it doesn't work. The Buddha ends up seeing all sorts of different types of stuff. He sees beggars. He sees poverty. He sees people with fighting and arguing. He sees people that clearly have not grown up in royalty. And it all has a tremendous effect on him. And in one version of the story goes that what had the most effect on him was seeing a man who was like limping with a cane and had been, partially missing leg due to disease, leprosy or something like that, who was severely disabled and severely crippled by disease. And of course, Buddha had never seen anything like that before. He had been sheltered from all of this. So this has a profound effect. And this would cut to the core of his real question about what's the point of living if life is suffering? What's the point of living if life is this lack of satisfaction? And he starts to realize that I'm going to reach this age at some point. I'm going to get old. We're all going to get old. That sucks. What's the point of everything if it all just withers away and we all get old and die, right? And we're all going to be in this state at some point or another. What's the point of living? And in another version of the story, he sees a monk when he's out there with a begging bowl going around with rags, and engaging in meditation and stuff like that. And he hasn't heard much yet about this either. And so he asks his driver, "What is that?" And the driver says, "Oh, that's an ascetic, what was called a sadhu monk. They're people who, they try to find spiritual enlightenment by kind of reducing all their natural desires and so forth." And the Buddha ultimately would be influenced by that to go off, leave his kingdom, and start his own journey. Now, of course, when he does go back to the kingdom one more time, and he tells his family and he tells his dad, "I'm out of here. You tried to shelter me from this, but I'm sorry. This isn't what life is about. There has to be something more. I have to find out the secret of what, how can we be okay with the decay of life and the aging process? If we're all going to die, how can we be okay with that?" And the father tries to convince. He says, "No, you'll have a great kingdom. You'll live a great life. Stay here. You have everything you ever want and need." And the soon-to-be Buddha says, "No, it's not. It's not. I'm not. I still feel a sense of dissatisfaction." And supposedly, and this is kind of an interesting part of the story to me too. Supposedly, his father tries to convince them one last time and throws a huge party, with all sorts of beautiful dancing women and people dancing in general and having a good time and amazing food and drink. And the soon-to-be Buddha, Siddartha, is not convinced. And not only that, he doesn't participate. And then when he wakes up in the morning before he's about to leave, he sees the tail end of the party, which I'm sure some of you have at least seen in a college party. People are drunk and people are puking because they're hungover, and the women don't look so attractive anymore. Their makeup's all run dry, and the guys are not looking so attractive themselves either. And so this just cements Siddhartha's view that this life of luxury and pleasure is really meaningless. And life in general, he thinks at that time, is meaningless. And so he decides, "I'm out of here." He asks they still try to convince him not to leave. He still leaves. And when he leaves, he's influenced by the monk he saw. So he ends up getting rid of all his royalty, all his nice clothes. He folds them up and gives them to his driver after he leaves the palace. Says, "Give these back to my dad." He makes, out of rags, he makes kind of a robe. He takes a begging bowl. He's going to beg for food when he gets hungry and needs it. And he, symbolically, he cuts off his hair. Because at that time, long hair was a symbol of royalty for men in that clan. So he completely disconnects from this kingdom. He says the life of indulgence, the life of material goods, does not lead to happiness. It does not lead to a deep satisfaction with life. And he starts off on his spiritual quest that in 6 years would end in his becoming enlightened. But before he gets there, he goes in the complete opposite direction. And he finds a group of monks to join who are wandering monks. They go through the forest and they practice what's sometimes called asceticism. Ascetic monks exist in other cultures too. But in this culture, they were, like I said, they were called sadhus. And they essentially restrict all food except what's necessary to survive. You're just eating a little bit of rice and water, maybe milk each day. You're spending long, long periods of time meditating, sometimes the whole day, just in deep meditation, trying to connect and develop your mind to be more, to be closer to finding the Atman, right? These people were really Hindus. And so the Buddha at first thinks this is the path, right? This has existed for thousands of years. But as I said before, ultimately he would part ways with this tradition. So over the course of those years, he does learn to develop himself very well in terms of meditation techniques. He follows many of the paths and instructions of the yogas we looked at, in particular Raja Yoga. He gets better and better at quieting his mind, getting closer and closer. And ultimately, he's been told, and this is what all the monks around him believe, ultimately he's going to find the Atman and realize his true nature is Brahman. And that's what he thinks. That's what everyone tells him is the meaning of life. They say, look, indulgence isn't the right way. This is the right way. He ends up becoming very, very skinny. And I know that goes against the picture you sometimes see the Buddha as kind of plump, right? And that's actually a metaphor. He was never actually plump in real life. And that image actually refers to some of the other Buddhas I was referring to. But there's a metaphorical reason why he's represented that way. I'll talk about that later. But in any case, towards the period of his enlightenment, which was about 36, he's skinny as a rail, right? To the point where you can see his ribs. And if you Google image search this, say skinny Buddha, you'll see some of the representations of him at this time in his life. But here's the thing. He still has not managed to find the meaning of life. He still feels that deep suffering that he would later call dukkha. He still feels the lack of satisfaction. And he would come to realize later that what he had done was replace one ego development, which is indulgence in the ego, to a restriction of ego. But he found them to be two sides of the same coin. Because in restricting your ego, you're equally bumping up your ego just in a different direction. Right? You're bumping up your ego in a way of like, I'm going to become the Atman. I'm going to be enlightened. So it was equally as personal and ego-driven. It was just couched up in the language of Hinduism. Like I said, he's a revolutionary. So the stories differ in terms of how he finally became enlightened. But one story is that he was wandering and angry that he couldn't figure things out, and he was losing sight of things, and he was really getting frustrated and ready to just give up on everything. And then kind of some random things happened. A woman gave him a bowl of rice milk, and suddenly when the milk hit his stomach, he had a realization that, wait a minute, life isn't about either of these things. I need to nourish myself, but I also need to not overindulge, and in that, there is a path towards a higher truth. This would later be called the middle path, that we'll talk about later. But ultimately, it ends with him sitting under a tree called the Bodhi tree, which people to this day still claim, the tree is long dead, but people claim to have seeds from the original tree that they've grown new trees with. But he sits under the Bodhi tree, and some say he was enlightened, and he saw the true nature of reality within a day. Others say it took a week. There's different stories there. But whatever it was that happened was he realized what would be what I mentioned at the beginning of the video, anatta, the idea that Atman wasn't the true goal. In fact, the real realization, the true nature of reality starts when you realize that there is no self at all. Not only is there no self in terms of your personality, but there's no grand self like Atman. And that's what true freedom from suffering comes from. That's what gets rid of that dukkha, that lack of satisfaction, is realizing there is no self to experience the dukkha. It's the fact that you believe there's a self that causes the dukkha. And so, just like getting rid of that domino, it prevents the other dominoes from falling. Now, one last thing before I wrap up this video. He was tempted. He was tempted by a spirit. I'm trying to remember the name of the spirit. Mara, which is like a god / spirit. Some people would call him a demon, but he's kind of like the god of the underworld. And he comes to the Buddha. And now many Buddhists today will interpret this as being more metaphorical, like a conversation the Buddha was having in his own mind. But there are some Buddhists who say that it really happened. In any case, the way the story is told is that this spirit or demon, Mara, comes and tries to keep the Buddha from being enlightened. Because in some ways he threatens the Buddha by being enlightened, because he's the god of the underworld and death and so forth. And by the way, this is again, there's a similarity to Jesus here, in that Satan tries to tempt Jesus, right? But Mara tries to tempt the Buddha, the soon-to-be Buddha, very soon in this case, in 3 ways. First, he tries to tempt him in terms of lust. He says, hey, Buddha, you're so close to this enlightenment thing where you're completely realizing the truth of reality, that there's no true core self, there's no Atman. And he says, maybe you'd like some women again, huh? Maybe that would make you feel better. And the Buddha's long beyond this. He said, nope, that's not gonna do it. And then he tries to tempt him with power. He says, well, I'll tell you what, look, you've realized the true nature of reality. Now you can go back and just live your life in charge of the kingdom, and you can get all the riches that your father always wanted. You can become a powerful king. Doesn't that sound good? And the Buddha says, no, I've already rejected that. That still doesn't tempt me. And then the last thing is interesting to me that he tries to tempt him with. He says, okay, so you're not tempted by any of the material possessions or indulgences of this world. Okay, fine. You've reached this pure samadhi. Remember, samadhi is that Hindu term meaning like liberation from the self and from the normal patterns of the self. And he says, you can be in this beautiful deep samadhi without having to deal with anybody else, right? You don't have to worry about anybody. You can just be in this. I'll allow you to be in this samadhi all on your own, and you can just bask in your own joy of knowing the true nature of reality. But what's interesting about this is that enlightenment is not personal. And the Buddha denounces this. And he says, no, absolutely not. Because that would have actually shown he wasn't enlightened if he just wanted to engage in his own samadhi. And the Buddha explicitly responds by saying, my purpose is to help others reach this state. My purpose is I have compassion for the other people, that I want to bring other people to out of the suffering that I went through. And when he says other people, he says, remember, he dissolves the caste system. He says, the caste system is irrelevant. Anybody can be enlightened. He says, I want to bring other people to this state. And he actually gives a metaphor, the Buddha, Siddartha, to this spirit. He gives the metaphor of a lotus garden, right? A lotus flower garden, which, as you remember, already had some symbolism in Hinduism, but has tremendous symbolism in Buddhism. And so he says, just like you see a lotus flowers sprouting in a garden, you will see some that are half grown, others that are dying, others that are only a few that are fully grown and fully flowering. And he said, I am like the sunlight for those lotus flowers, and the lotus flowers are like the people in this world. I have compassion for those people. I want to be the sunlight to help them grow. So this actually answers a deep misunderstanding of Buddhism from some people in the West in particular, who see enlightenment kind of as a personal, selfish thing. Oh, you just wanted to expand your own mind and develop yourself? No, the goal is compassion for all beings, and it is a logical consequence of enlightenment. Enlightenment naturally and directly leads to compassion. And anyways, lots of questions still to answer there. In particular, what is enlightenment? I've touched a little bit on it there, but in the next video I'll talk more about enlightenment itself and how we can unpack that.